So the third phase of learning is transfer. And I want to start our discussion of transfer with a couple of quotes again from Hattie and Stern's book, Visible Learning for Social Studies. They write, when we spend time in the transfer phase, students take ownership of their learning because they see the value. In the transfer phase of learning, we want students to gain more independence in identifying similarities and differences that are temporally or conceptually more removed from one another. So remember that the transfer phase is application. We're transferring our understanding of these same concepts that we acquired at the surface level, and then we deepened our understanding at the deep level understanding, and now we need to begin to make connections to novel situations. So it's the association here between a previously learned situation and the novel situation that's linked through these organizing concepts. It's also important here that we understand our patterns of thought, our operational schema about the relationships among these concepts that we've developed in our deep learning processing. And then third, metacognitive skills. That is, we continue to monitor our own thinking to detect similarities and differences, and we see how our own thinking evolves. Now, if you're thinking then, how do I distinguish between the deep level understanding where we're making comparisons across individual discrete events to draw conclusions about these concepts, and transfer, it really is a matter of degree. So the degree of distance or difference among the concepts, whether that's a difference in time historically or a difference in space geographically, we're making new connections between concepts that are further removed from one another. So if we think back to our examples of the headlines, and we're talking about federalism, for example, we would want to apply our understanding of federalism. And again, most of us probably would never have thought to, pose the question, what happens during a nationwide or a global pandemic in terms of power between the states and the federal government? And can the federal government compel state governments to keep their economies open or to shut down their economies? Those are not typical case studies or examples that we would use. But if we understand federalism at a surface level, if we've done the concept attainment and then we've begun to look at some deeper level applications of federalism as they've played out in American history, now we take that same understanding and we apply it to the new novel situation. It's also important when we think about transfer that we understand context. Because as we're making connections across time and place, we have to consider, especially when we're thinking about primary sources, and we talked about this a lot in our discussion of close reading and deep learning and the relationship between the two. But now as we begin to think about transfer, application to new context, we have to think about how do the documents that we're reading fit into the context in which they emerge, because understanding the initial context in which they emerge is then important to being able to make later application. So this particular piece actually does not come from the Visible Learning book. This is my connection here that I see. This comes from Sam Weinberg's latest book, Why Teach History When It's Already on Your Phone. And if you're familiar with Weinberg's work in the Stanford History Education Group, you know the importance of what they call historical thinking or contextualized thinking. So here what we have is the proclamation for Columbus Day, which we, of course, just recently had a presidential proclamation on Columbus Day as well, and of course all of the controversy that surrounds whether we should even be having Columbus Day or whether it should be repurposed as Indigenous Peoples Day, etc. But this is from Benjamin Harrison's Columbus Day proclamation in 1892. And so you can read Here the text, whereas by a joint resolution approved June 29th, 1892, it was resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that the President of the United States be authorized and directed to issue a proclamation recommending to the people the observance in all their localities of the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America on the 21st day of October 1892 by public demonstration and by suitable exercise in their schools or other places of assembly. Now, therefore, I, Benjamin Harrison, President of the United States of America, in pursuance of the aforesaid joint resolution, do hereby appoint Friday, October 21st, 1892, the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus as a general holiday for the people of the United States. And so you can go on to read that, but you get the idea here of what's happening with Benjamin Harrison's Columbus Day Proclamation. Now, I want you to look at some examples when students were asked to read this particular proclamation and to sort of reflect on what it was that they were reading. And this is a high school student named Jacob who responded with immediacy and passion. The first thing that jumps out is that Columbus is a pioneer of progress and enlightenment, he noted, which was certainly one way of looking at it. But from what I've heard, his goals were not entirely noble. Just get rich, whatever, find a way to the Indies, show that the earth wasn't flat. And then Jacob grumbled, it praises him for his devout faith. He claimed to be a true Christian, but he also captured and tortured Indians. So he wasn't maybe as noble as this is having him to be. Asked if he noticed anything else, Jacob added, and the fact that it's becoming a holiday that we're supposed to revere, that's even worse. So if you think about this, how might you kind of rate Jacob's analysis here if you were to give it a score of, let's say, 1 to 5? You might score Jacob fairly high. This is a pretty advanced AP student here who has some pretty good analysis here. But I want you to compare that to how some graduate students in history, what they thought when they did a sort of think aloud with this same particular text. Here's graduate student A who says, a shameless appeal to superheroes in order to gain votes in urban centers. Quite a bit different analysis here than Jacob is giving. And then graduate student B who goes on to say, okay, it's 1892. It's 1892, so it's the 400th anniversary. Benjamin Harrison, curious. It's not on the front page. Why? But it is in the New York Times, the so-called national newspaper. The 1890s, the beginning of the progressive era, end of the century, closing of the frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner. You've got the Columbian Exposition coming up the following year, the biggest wave of immigration in U.S. history. That's it. So what's going on here? The graduate students are reading this document very differently than Jake. What they're doing is they're reading the document contextually. Notice that graduate student B goes immediately to 1892. That doesn't really come up in Jacob's line of thought. He thinks about 1492 and how we are commemorating Christopher Columbus. And so he has some good ideas here on Christopher Columbus and the critical approach to progress and enlightenment. But what Jacob isn't doing is contextualizing Benjamin Harrison's proclamation. He's not thinking about what's happening in the world of 1892. And that's what the graduate students are doing. And what they understand is that this proclamation is aimed at, as graduate student A said, votes in urban centers. Who lives in urban centers in 1892? It's at the end of graduate student B, the biggest wave of immigration in U.S. history. There's a huge influx of new American citizens and Italian Americans among them. but also Irish Americans who are also Roman Catholics. So there's an appeal here to Christianity. And so you see these graduate students placing the document into historical context and understanding that Benjamin Harrison's proclamation for Columbus Day is as much about what's happening in the context of 1892, much more than it really is thinking about 1492. And so I use this here to illustrate the importance then of when we're thinking about transfer, that we think about transfer in a way that we understand that context is important before we move from one context to another and we draw conclusions about how these concepts from one particular context apply to a new context, that we've thought deeply about the immediate context in which these events or documents take place. And I think that's really critical to our understanding of transfer, is first contextualize and then be able to draw the comparisons across time and place and into new situations. So as we then go to breakout 3, I want you to think about what are some of your transfer goals. And as you think about transfer goals, I want you to think about the rule of 40. What do you want students to know 40 weeks from now, or 40 months from now, or 40 years from now? The big picture takeaway concepts. What are your transfer goals? And then what strategies do you use to help students transfer their learning to new contexts? So we'll go into breakout with those discussion questions.